So, Mrs. Hathaway, I would like to start how, let's say, if you could describe to me what was the difference between the position you had in the Bush administration and the one which you had in Obama administration. So we can start it off with this. Maybe.
Okay, all right, well thank you very much. When I was asked to come into the administration of President George W. Bush in 2007, and I was then working for the Director of National Intelligence, who his name is Mike McConnell, and he was my boss in industry, and he asked two of us to come in to the government with him. I had been leading the cybersecurity business unit for Booz Allen Hamilton at the time, and so I had been working in cybersecurity for then almost 20 years. And I was asked to lead the National Cybersecurity Initiative, or created the National Cybersecurity Initiative for President Bush beginning in 2007. At that time, President Bush realized that the defensive posture of the United States of America wasn't as strong as it needed to be. And I was asked to, how do we strengthen it, and how do I lead in and bring together an all-of-government initiative that could bring the best of what we know how to do from a broad-based all skill set, offensive, etc., to defensive posture. And I created the strategy, an all-of-government strategy that addressed 4 key areas or initiatives in raising our defensive posture. The first was on from an insider threat, those people who are not necessarily spies per se, but those people who are using using tainted technology and bringing it into a trusted environment. That can be a thumb drive or a BlackBerry or any other multimedia device that you use to connect into the overall enterprise. The second part of the initiative was to look at a proximity access, and certainly this is more important as we're moving more and more into a wireless networked world where you don't have to be connected to the computer or to the enterprise, you can just be in the wireless environment. Well, there's not many protections for that wireless environment, so how do you raise the overall defensive posture for a proximity access or just being in a co-located area or a nearby location? The third area for the defensive posture was to raise our security around coming in over and through the internet to the enterprises. As you know, this is an area that all of our countries have been working on since the early 1990s, and our posture, our defensive posture, security posture still isn't very good. And as we move in advance into the next generation technologies, we need to think more and more about the defensive posture that we have as we interface with the internet. And then the fourth area that we looked at for the defensive posture under President Bush was looking at our supply chain security and how do we address the global supply chain and where one could potentially manipulate or harness or take over a critical infrastructure because the equipment was modified or built someplace else. During the last 2 years of the Bush administration, we worked very hard with and partnered with our Congress to get the funding and the resources appropriate for that particular strategy. And then I had the opportunity to transition the strategy for President Obama. President Obama asked me to take a look at the overall policy landscape within the United States, review the strategy that we had done for President Bush, and then expand it into a broader all-of-nation strategy as opposed to an all-of-government strategy. And that had 5 key components to it and 25 recommendations. The first main area was about how do you address executive accountability, both in the government and in the private sector, for enhancing the overall nation's posture. The second was increasing awareness of the population writ large to help them understand what was at stake as we embrace the internet and all of the information technologies that are available today. The third area was how do we increase information sharing between the government and the business, between the governments around the world to enhance our collective security posture. The fourth area addressed how, if and when there's an event, how do we enable and facilitate incident response quickly, and what laws and or new policies need to be introduced in order to affect that in a positive direction. And then the fifth area was how do we enhance our research and development posture to anticipate the next generation technologies and then build in the security aspects along the way.
I would like to start, let's say, briefly on the part of cooperation between the governments, because I would be, let's say, pretty curious about what were, or if you are pretty much aware or could say something about was the cooperation between the American, let's say, government and some EU, let's say, officials, or is there any cooperation between the EU and the US in this field?
Yes, there is cooperation between the United States and the European Union formally. We have a working group. There's also on big strategy and policy. There's also a working group between the European Commission and our National Science Foundation, and money being brought to bear on the next generation internet from both the United States and the European Commission. There's also initiatives between the NATO countries and how to enhance our overall NATO security posture, which the United States is significantly contributing to that conversation.
I can imagine that in, let's say, NATO structures could be a bit closer to the US, let's say, defensive posture on this topic than the European affairs one. Is it right?
The European the EAS is working with our Department of Homeland Security on the overall security posture for the EU. What NATO and the United States and the European Union have in common is enhancing the security posture of our critical infrastructures to help all nations develop a cybersecurity strategy, and all nations to have an emergency response capability. Excuse me.
Just go for it. No
Let
problem.
me turn it
No
off.
problem at all.
I'm sorry.
You are busy, it looks like.
I'll put it on silent.
It really doesn't matter. We can cut it off.
I published an article last night, and it's getting a lot of press, and that was a reporter.
I can imagine.
The friendly reporters.
They want to all
link to it and comment on it, so it's...
All right, would you like to speak about it a bit or not? What you have published? I'm not really sure what you have published, but would you like to speak about it a bit or not?
Yeah, I can speak to it.
All right, so you have published an article last night.
I wrote an article yesterday regarding how do we change the conversation on the international landscape. Many of our countries are talking about espionage and warfare, and it's escalating in the media by all reports. And we're not talking about really the economic aspects of cybersecurity. So I wrote an article talking about the GDP losses that our countries are experiencing as we adopt information communications technology. Our countries expect anywhere from 4 to 10% GDP growth. That's quite significant, especially in a stagnant economy or in austere times. But we're not measuring the GDP losses due to e-crime and e-fraud or intellectual property theft. And I highlighted that the Netherlands has published a report that said that it's losing at minimum 2% of its GDP growth to e-crime and e-fraud, and that the United Kingdom is measuring their GDP losses at near 3%. So if you start to think about what's at stake for your growth as you adopt information communications technologies, and then you begin to look at the new threats to our infrastructures, like the Shamoon virus against Saudi Aramco, where Saudi Aramco had 30,000 computers destroyed, or the most recent attacks against the South Korean financial institutions as well as the United States financial institutions, that perhaps it's best if we started to, among nations, discuss this regarding the economics, and that it's about our economic well-being. And I offered forward that perhaps this should be one of the key topics for the G20, as Russia is currently the president of the G20, and there's still time to enable it to reach the G20 agenda before their September meeting. And Australia will be convening the G20 as their presidency assumes in 2014, and perhaps Australia could take forward this on behalf of the global, economic well-being and the Internet's future.
Forgive me for getting a bit general, but I would like to ask whether, let's say, the Obama administration and the Bush administration before, let's say, put a significant, let's say, focus on cyber strategy and or defense, or in comparison to some European states, as far as I know or I'm concerned, I would like to say let's say the European states are not really aware, but they don't put a lot of focus, let's say, in financial capabilities for their experts. And my question is whether you think that how does the political will to let's say to put the money, put the resources in experts, where does it come from? It must come from some, let's say, attack to your country, and then the politician says, well, really, we have to take care of it, so let's bring the experts in. Or where is, let's say, the bridge? Where's the brink? When does it mean?
In the United States, we have a saying that says, "Put your money where your mouth is," and I think that most of the European countries have cybersecurity strategies now, or are in progress of publishing them. The cybersecurity dialogue has been occurring since the early 2000s, and I think really began with the Y2K bug, the Millennium bug, in the year 2000. But progressed in the years 2003 and 2005 because the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, began the World Summit on Information Society that talked about everybody's development is going to be dependent upon ICT adoption and broadband development in each of our countries, and that could lead to this GDP growth. So the beginning strategies around Europe, in addition to the 2000 timeframe, really started in 2005, 2006, 2007. And now they're being updated to the new threats and and increased awareness on why we need to focus on both the economic benefit of the internet and broadband and the internet economy, as well as maintain and understand the security aspects of it.
Since you have, let's say, wide experience as a high-profiled policymaker, I would like to ask whether you think, since the topic has become a political topic as well, let's say in the US, let's say maybe in the presidential campaign last fall, let's say Mitt Romney says a few words about the Chinese hackers. Do you think that the topic of cybersecurity will get to a political agenda more often, since, let's say, the Chinese, I can't generalize, but the hackers are, let's say, being a bit seen on the political stage as well?
Yes, I believe that cybersecurity will become more of the mainstream of the policy debates and our politics of our countries. I see that because it falls into 6 categories. The first are political activists, and that could be people who are using Facebook and Twitter to mobilize for political action, or for those who are using the internet to move a political agenda, like an Anonymous or a LulzSec or the different political
or
activists.
WikiLeaks maybe.
WikiLeaks. This is a perfect example. The second area is because of organized crime. And just with the recent theft against the ATMs, just last week, when I think it was $45 million in 30 minutes, that we're going to have to address the true aspects of the new bank robbers of the 21st century. The third area is those who are stealing for intellectual property, illegally copying intellectual property from all of our businesses, whether that's the next generation weapon system or it's the next generation oil and gas drilling capability. That intellectual property theft is at epidemic high across all of our countries. The fourth area is thinking about and addressing the espionage, state against state, true stealing of secrets. Then the fifth area is disruption of services, just like we saw here in March against your financial institutions and your stock exchange, that we saw in South Korea just a few weeks ago against their financial institutions, and what we're seeing in the United States against our financial institutions. True disruption of service is not just an inconvenience, it could lead to other disasters. And then the last area that will put it on the political agenda is because of true destruction of property, like we saw with Saudi Aramco and the 30,000 computers, and like we saw with Stuxnet against the Iranian nuclear power plant.
Could you imagine that somewhere in, let's say, in the future, there might be a time when a government, not really an American government, but some other government, can, let's say, decide to move on, let's say, military options, or put military options on the table because of some hacker attack? So that, let's say, the evaluation could be so precise, so the government can say, okay, really, so those were the North Koreans, so this is what we consider an act of war, so we are putting it on table. Could you imagine that it might happen somewhere in the near future?
Yes. There was a recent publication out of Estonia, the NATO Cyber Center of Excellence there, called the Talon Manual, where it was a group of attorneys pulling together to discuss what are the laws of armed conflict in the cyber arena, and it addresses what would be the material thresholds that would allow for a country to use all means of power to address a cyber incident or attack. I do believe that that's going to be, again, back into the policy debate among all countries of what is an act of war or an act of armed aggression that would result in the use of the full gambit of power of a nation.
I can imagine the field I want to move on might be a bit, let's say, confidential, so sometimes when you feel that way, just say maybe I'm not going to go forward. But since we are talking about, let's say, the controlled attacks, when we are speaking from, let's say, the democratic parts of the world, all the states say that they have, let's say, defensive structures in the cyberspace. Could you imagine somewhere in the future that there might be the time when the government will, let's say, put on a new body which could prepare not really an attack, but some moves in the cyber center or some cyber space against some other government, like use it as a, let's say, definitive part of their army or armed forces?
I believe that, yes.
It might be happening already, but I'm just wondering.
So the United States has stood up a cyber command as part of our military infrastructure, and there are at least 40 other countries who have established a cyber command, to include Brazil and China. Syria has a military unit that's addressing cyber activities, and so yes, many countries are developing this as cyber capabilities as part of their military arsenal.
You've been a member of the NSC as well. So some people say that the cyber experts are not really, let's say, democratically controlled. I know, I can imagine it's just a phrase, but since you were involved in the administration as well, could you just distinguish for me where's the difference between where's the, let's say, intelligence field where there it's not really transparent, I could say, because of the confidential reasons, and when there are some, let's say, visible policy makers such as you were in Obama's administration or Bush administration before?
So I was not as visible in the Bush administration, largely because my role was to work in all of government strategy and not be publicly visible as I was working that, and that was a lot of work. The United States strategy is an all-of-government strategy, and we have capabilities that are resident in all parts of our government that range from our intelligence community to our law enforcement community to our Department of Homeland Security, which is like your ministries of Interior, and our Department of Commerce, etc. So how does one work and get all of those public-facing entities and non-public-facing entities work together? And then when there is a public face, how do you orchestrate that in a positive direction? I think that the United States is still learning how to do this. In the last few years, our public-facing spokesmen and women have been mostly out of our Department of Homeland Security and our Ministry of Defense, and less so out of other of our institutions, less out of the White House, and less out of our Department of Commerce or our Department of State. Whereas in other countries, it's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Ministry of Interior or the Ministry of Justice that is the lead face to the rest of the world. Sometimes that is because its law enforcement has been designated the lead, or its critical infrastructure is the most important thing to the country. And so you start to see the face that's leading, as the voice may also suggest of what the most important thing is to the country.
And my last question would be directed to where's, let's say, the difference, or where are the most experts on cybersecurity, or to your opinion, where should they be placed? Whether they should be, let's say, in the armed forces, or somewhere else in, let's say, in the governmental structures, because I know the American model is pretty transparent and pretty well known, let's say, but in the European, let's say, Union or European countries, most of the countries have, let's say, some difficulties whether they should push those policymakers or the decision makers in this area, where they should move them to, let's say, armed forces or somewhere to the civil structures such as Ministry of Defense. Could you just elaborate shortly on that? How do you feel?
Well, the laws of Europe and the countries here are a little bit different than the ones in the United States. Our core capabilities in the United States and the true centers of excellence reside in our intelligence community, our National Security Agency, and our Ministry of Defense, and less so in our Department of Homeland Security. And whereas I think that and our laws, though, are hamstring us from helping move our Department of Homeland Security forward in an operational capability, and even though they're the lead with the private sector. I think that if we could rapidly gain more expertise in our Department of Homeland Security, the Ministry of Interior, that would be better for our country as a whole. And we're trying to figure out how to leverage the expertise where it is now and move it into where we really need it for tomorrow. I think in Europe, your regulatory authorities and your resourcing authorities are aligned with where the infrastructure priorities are. And so now it's a question of how do you grow your expertise in the ministries of Justice or Interior in order to protect the critical infrastructures of Europe. So the United States, I think, could learn a lot from Europe on how to align our laws and policies to meet where our capability needs are.
All right. So thank you very much. It was like 25 minutes, so I don't want to.
Oh, really?